Hey everyone, and welcome back to MakerVibe. In today's video, we're going to go over a simple program to find the largest among three given numbers inside of Python. We're going to do it in two different ways, so let's jump right in and get started. The first method uses if-else statements to check the numbers one at a time and find the largest one. So here inside of Python, I'm going to start by allowing the user to input the first number. So number 1 is equal to input, and let's prompt the user, let's say enter number 1. And although this will work, the problem with this is Python will automatically interpret this input to be a string. We don't really want it to be a string, we want it to be a number. And more specifically, we want it to be a floating point number in case the user enters something like 24.5 or 3.14. So we're going to take this and we're going to put it inside of a float function. And what this will do is it will take the input and convert it to a floating point number. And that's exactly what we want. Okay, and now I want to do the same thing for number 2 and number 3. So I'm going to copy this, put it over here, call this number 2, number 2, whoops. And over here, we're going to do number 3 and number 3. Okay, great. Now the program is ready to accept these numbers as input and convert them to floating points. Okay, so to start with the if-else statement example, what we're going to do is first check if number 1 is greater than number 2. So let's put that in. We're going to say if number 1 is greater than number 2. And if this condition is true, what do we want to do? Well, the next thing would be is to check if number 1 is also greater than number 3. So let's type in if number 1 is greater than number 3. And now what do we put in here? If both of these conditions are true, well, that kind of means that number 1 is the greatest number, right? Because if number 1 is bigger than number 2 and it's also bigger than number 3, then number 1 must be the largest. So we can say largest num equals number 1. Now, what if number 1 is greater than number 2, but number 1 is not greater than number 3? So what do we do here? We need to now branch off and create an else statement. So we're going to do else. So let's follow what this means. This means that number 1 is greater than number 2, but number 1 is not greater than number 3. So what does that mean? Well, that must mean that number 3 is the largest. So largest num is equal to number 3. So that takes care of the case where number 1 is greater than number 2. But what if that's not the case? To address that, we're going to need to create an else if statement here. Number 2 is greater than number 3. So now we've realized that number 1 is not greater than number 2. Okay, that's fine. So number 1 is not greater than 2, but now we want to check is number 2 greater than number 3. And if that's the case, then that must mean that the largest number is number 2. And finally, we've got one more case to check, which is when number 1 is not greater than number 2, and number 2 is also not greater than number 3. So we can just put else here. And in that case, well, if number 1 is less than number 2, and number 2 is less than number 3, that means the largest number must be number 3. So largest num is equal to number 3. And that's pretty much it. Okay, and now we need to print out the result of this calculation so we can see it. So let's say print, and I'm going to do some string formatting here. And let's say the largest number among number 1, number 2, and number 3 is, and we can put largest num here. All right, so let's run this and see if it works. Cool, so we are asked to enter number 1. Let's type in 10. Number 2, let's give it 21. And number 3, let's say is 21.1. And you can see here that the largest number among 10, 21, and 21.1 is 21.1. Okay, so before moving on, what I want to do is I want to show you some examples of what this if-else logic will do if we give it different numbers. And we're going to try to follow along and imagine what the code is going to do, because that way we're really going to understand how this logic works, because it's kind of hard to see, like, number 1, number 2, and number 3. So let's go through some examples. I'm just going to quickly toggle the line numbers here so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I've got here is a table for number 1, number 2, and number 3, and we're just going to talk through some examples. So in the first case, let's imagine number 1 is 17, number 2 is 12, and number 3 is 8. And we're going to try to follow what this code will do if we give it these three numbers. So the first thing we see is the code is going to check in line number 5. It's going to check if number 1 is greater than number 2. And 17 is greater than 12. So this condition is true. Now it's going to jump into the nested statement inside of this if statement. And that is this line over here, line number 6. So now it's going to check is number 1 greater than number 3. And if we look at the table, we can see 17 is greater than 8. So now it's going to jump further into the nest and look at this line, line number 7. And if number 1 is greater than number 2, and number 1 is also greater than number 3, then that simply means that the largest number must be number 1. And of course that is correct because the answer should be 17. Okay, let's see another example now. So we've got number 1 is 13, number 2 is 15, and number 3 is 11. So what is the program going to do? Well, again, it's going to start with line number 5, and it's going to see that number 1 is now not greater than number 2. So it's going to skip all of this nested statement and go on to the next branch. And in this branch, it's going to check, well, is number 2 greater than number 3? And we can see that, yes, 15 is greater than 11. So it's now going to move inside of this statement and execute this line, line number 11. And of course, if number 1 is not greater than number 2, and number 2 is greater than number 3, then the largest number must be number 2. And we can see that in the table, the answer should be 15, so that is correct. Okay, let's try one more example here. So we're going to say number 1 is 15, number 2 is 16, and number 3 is 19. So what is our program going to do with these numbers? Well, it's first going to check, as before, it's going to check if number 1 is greater than number 2. That is not the case, so it's going to skip all of this and move on to this one. And now it's going to see, well, is number 2 greater than number 3? And we can see that 16 is not greater than 19, so it's also going to skip this branch. And of course, there's only one possibility left, and that possibility is the fact that, well, if number 1 is less than number 3 and number 2 is less than number 3, that means number 3 must be the largest number. And that is how you follow along with this if-else statement logic. Okay, now in the final part of this video, I want to show you how you can solve this whole problem using a single line of code inside of Python. Because although this is an acceptable solution, this is very long-winded and it's good as an example, but if you're creating any kind of a functional program, it's not really gonna do it. It's just too long. So let's get rid of all of this, and let's also turn the line numbers off because we don't need that anymore. And let's write the line that's going to solve our problem. So we're going to say largest num as before, and we're going to say this is equal to the maximum function. And as you can see here in the little pop-up, it's basically asking you to put the numbers in that you want to find the maximum from. So let's open a bracket and let's put in number 1, number 2, and number 3. And let's watch the magic happen. Let's run this script. Okay, number 1 I'm going to say is 5.3. Number 2 is minus 6.6. And number 3, let's just say is minus 2.1. And the largest number is 5.3, which is correct. Okay, and that is 2 ways you can find the largest among 3 numbers inside of Python. Now, which method should you use? Well, I've already kind of spoken about it before, but method 1 is really just for an illustration. It's kind of there to help you understand how to control logical flow inside of your program. It's kind of designed for more complicated things. For something as simple as this, where there's already a function that solves a problem, it's much better to just use the function because it makes your program a lot faster, and of course it makes it a lot shorter, which is usually a good thing. Okay, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for some more awesome Python videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.